Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this series of dynamic national conversations on creative youth development. I'm Heather Eichmeyer, Chief Program Officer at the National Guild for Community Arts Education, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. I'm joined by an incredible group of speakers who will introduce themselves to you in just a moment. The Creative Youth Development Learning Series is designed to amplify key themes in a set of forthcoming written briefs authored by field experts. Each webinar will engage with a diverse community of stakeholders, youth, experts, funders, practitioners, to explore new paths forward for creative youth development practice. During today's webinar, Trends in CYD Programs, we will share key trends and approaches to CYD program development highlighted in Denise Montgomery's recent landscape paper, and look at work happening in communities across the country with specific insights shared by leaders at two exemplary creative youth development organizations, Artworks LA and Youth Speaks, both in California. This online series is brought to you by the Creative Youth Development National Partnership in collaboration with Grantmakers for Education's Arts Education Impact Group. It is hosted by the National Guild for Community Arts Education and made possible by generous support from the Claire Rose Foundation. The written briefs on which this webinar is based and the forthcoming are part of a first phase of a CYD toolkit for the field. This is a multi-year partnership project led by Americans for the Arts. This webinar is scheduled to last 60 minutes, and due to the large number of participants, your lines have been muted. So if you'd like to ask a question, and we really encourage you to ask questions all along the way, or share an idea or an insight, please do so. And to do so, you just want to toggle at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a speech bubble that says chat. Go ahead and type your questions, your comments, your insights into the chat box there at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring those throughout today's presentation, and we'll have a good 20 or 30 minutes today to really delve into dialogue after we hear from our three speakers. So thanks again for being here today. I also just wanted to remind you that today's webinar is being recorded. And so following the webinar, you will get both a recording as well as another link to Denise's paper in case you missed it in advance. And we really encourage you to share out these materials with your colleagues and with your local communities post today's event. So before we dive in, I'd love to give our speakers an opportunity to introduce themselves to you. So we'll start with Denise.
Hi, I'm Denise Montgomery, and my consulting firm is CultureThrive. Creative youth development has been a key focus area for me, both research on program practice and strategy to advance the field for the past 8 years. And this paper is my 8th publication on creative youth development. Currently, I'm conducting a landscape analysis on creative youth development in San Diego, where there is an active and connected cluster of high-performing creative youth development organizations. And in addition to my work in CYD, I also work with a number of museums, and I serve on the education planning team for the Smithsonian Latino Center. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Christy Johnston-Limon, and I'm the Executive Director of Youth Speaks. I've been working in creative arts education and youth development for the last 15 years of my career, and I actually am from the San Francisco Bay Area. I have a background in community development, arts education, nonprofit administration, and I'm also a student of the arts. Very happy to join you all today.
Hi everyone, my name is Shelby Williams-Gonzalez and I'm the Executive Director of Artworks LA. I've been with Artworks LA for 11 and a half years. I've been in arts education for 19. I started as a teaching artist in the classroom and then I became the Executive Director about 8 months ago for Artworks LA. I also have a dance and choreography background, so I'm coming from a performing perspective and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all. We're so excited to have the three of you with us today. And without further ado, I hand things off to you, Denise.
Thank you. So Creative youth development is a recent term for a longstanding field of practice, and this is a field with long and deep grassroots and community-based origins. And in the paper, I provide an historical foundation of CYD as a field, and including the research, the decades of research that have influenced and examined and document this work. So I'm going to highlight just one part of that today, and that is the Search Institute's assets-based model, because of how influential it has been to this work. And the Search Institute's work on assets came into prominence in the early 1990s. And what this means is to recognize that all people, including all young people, have strengths, and to work from that place of strengths and assets, which was a real shift away from what had been a deficit orientation toward young people that was very prominent in the 1980s, and that had more of a focus on what young people were perceived to be lacking, and use language such as describing young people as threats. And so this change was really, has been enormous in the overall field of youth development, and is very much a part of creative youth development with its assets-based approach. Moving into some of the existing frameworks of high quality program practice on the next slide, this heterogeneous field has in recent years codified program practices, and there are just two shown here. One is Boston Youth Arts Evaluation Project's framework for outcomes in youth arts programs. And this is a layered and outstanding framework that I encourage you to access if you haven't already, and you see that I create, I am, we connect, overlapping circles. There's also in the Something to Say report from the Wallace Foundation, 10 principles for high quality out of school time arts programs, including the foundational principle of working with practicing professional artists. And there's an array of resources to access to deepen practice and to learn more about creative youth development. And those are available through the Creative Youth Development National Partnerships website. So I encourage you to access those. Meanwhile, the field is dynamic, and that's why we're here today to discuss current trends and also some tensions. So the first trend, holistic approaches evolving as needs grow, is really an expansion because creative youth development is holistic in nature and is concerned with the entirety of a young person's life, their social and emotional well-being, mental health, safety, basic life needs for food, shelter, and clothing. And CYD programs are seeing that those needs, and society are seeing that those needs are really growing for young people in this political climate, and with the rates of poverty and food insecurity, social isolation, depression, anxiety, trauma, and creative youth development programs are resourcefully and creatively and innovatively meeting those needs. And they're doing that in a variety of ways, ranging from restorative circles to mindfulness, to partnerships with social services organizations, to staffing their programs with social services professionals alongside teaching artists. And programs are also accessing professional development on trauma-informed practice. And there's a growing focus on what Sean Ginwright calls healing-centered engagement. And I discussed this in the paper and highly recommend Sean Ginwright's work, and a really eloquent essay that he wrote for Medium that reminds us to take an assets-based approach to this work, which healing-centered engagement does. And an important aspect of this trend is that those adults who are engaged in supporting healing for young people must heal themselves and routinely. restore themselves. And so here's one of the areas of tension or areas of need and opportunity, and that is that self-care is typically not viewed as part of CYD program design, yet it is inherent to CYD program delivery. And I know that a lot of organizations are doing a lot to embed self-care for practitioners in their program models. And I'd love to hear more about that too, either on this webinar or outside of the webinar. So the second trend is about collaboration across sectors, and this is also a great strategy. And creative youth development has mutual goals with allied youth sectors, including juvenile justice and health and wellness, education, workforce development, and these adjacent sectors or allied youth sectors are being receptive to CYD, in part because they're seeing the high levels of engagement among young people who are involved in CYD programs. And increasingly, creative youth development organizations and programs are working with partners in allied sectors. And they're doing this for a number of reasons. One is to connect with more young people. Others are to provide some of these holistic services and supports, to find ways to work with court-involved or incarcerated youth, and to diversify and grow funding. So this has been a growing and important trend that's really proving to be effective. The next trend is really exciting because it's about the next generation of program staff and leadership with new approaches. And program alumni are taking on leadership roles and are bringing that direct experience as program participants and profound understanding of the young people who are participating in CYD programs to their work and their leadership. And this new generation, which includes program alumni, but isn't limited to program alumni, is working in new ways outside of traditional nonprofit structures. They're entrepreneurial, they are innovating at the program level and at the organizational level. They are diversifying revenue and increasing earned revenue. And these leaders are the vanguard in CYD. And you'll see that as you hear from Christy and Shelby. The fourth trend is scaling by depth. And what that means is investing substantial time and resources in the young people that are involved in CYD programs, or going deeper, rather than the traditional notion of scaling up, which typically means to expand the number of program participants, possibly through an expansion of the geographic service area. And the reason why a lot of organizations do this and are really deepening this practice is because in order to engage in high-level skill building and building trusting relationships, it's conducive and necessary to have deep levels of engagement. And these are the hallmarks of CYD programs, those relationships and the hands-on skill building, high-level skill building. So it's really a part of programs. However, with so many young people lacking equitable access to high-quality CYD programs, there is tension about scaling by depth and a desire to serve more young people. And many organizations have a mix of programs that include programming that really goes deep, and then other programming that also isn't as high touch or as high dosage and allows them to work with even more young people. Also, and I should mention too that the Wallace Foundation and Boys and Girls Clubs of America, they are engaged in a multi-year initiative to look at adapting those principles from the Something to Say report to a Boys and Girls Club setting and modifying them to be able to work with larger numbers of young people. And they're publishing their insights along the way. And it's an important project, I think, and a great source of insight into how to find ways to work with even more young people while maintaining quality. Also, while funders are growing in their awareness and understanding of creative youth development, some funders, both public and private, continue to press for greater numbers of young people served and lower cost per young person. And creative youth development programs that are engaging in deep work can be penalized in grants processes that are looking at some of those numbers and giving them more weight than perhaps than the program practices. So that's another area of tension and opportunity for raising awareness. The last trend that I will touch on today is about the heightened focus on creative career pathways. And economic opportunity is essential to social justice, and organizations are building...
anywhere that I can get onto the audio on the...
economic opportunity is essential to social justice, and CYD organizations are building into their program models progressions of skill building and experiences to support young people in pursuing creative careers. Organizations are expanding their networks to foster creative career development opportunities for young people, and they're continuing to provide support and to remain engaged with program alumni. So they're supporting young people as they begin working in creative industries, and they certainly aren't cutting them off. And Shelby will share in a few moments more about Artworks LA's substantial work in this area. The paper has a number of recommendations, and I hope that you'll read the paper. It's a quick read, and there are recommendations both for action and for further inquiry. And I'd love to collaborate with anyone who's interested in pursuing some of these lines of inquiry. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to mention just 3 recommendations, and one is to support, catalyze, and connect local, state, and regional peer learning networks. We have one here in San Diego where I live, the San Diego Creative Youth Development Network, and it's really powerful and effective. Organizations are engaged in professional development, peer learning, sharing, collaboration, and there need to be more networks of this kind and investment in these networks and capacity for them, because they're really effective, and because so much of the work, including being authentically rooted to community and finding ways to work cross-sector in communities and regions, it's so unique and so locally rooted. So these kinds of networks are important. Also, as mentioned before, building and amplifying methods for CYD program staff to heal and renew themselves. And then also knowledge gaps should be addressed with the active input of practitioners and of young people. I'm pleased to turn over the conversation to Christy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Denise. And I just want to thank you again for your work in capturing so many of the trends that our nonprofits are experiencing. And so today I'm going to actually talk a little bit about our leadership approaches that are being responsive to the evolution in our field. And like most of us who've been around for at least a generation in this field, really grappling with how to engage our alumni who really are seeking meaningful work in the organizations that have played such a pivotal role in their learning and their development and their civic awareness and engagement, while we're also confronting the reality that our organizations operate in ways that maybe don't best serve our alumni when they do become employees and start to take on those leadership roles. So I'll be talking a little bit about that and sharing a couple of examples. But just by way of introduction, hi again, I'm Christy Johnston-Limon, Executive Director of Youth Speaks, and I have been there for 18 months. Prior to my tenure at Youth Speaks, where I actually followed the founder of 22 years, I was at Destiny Art Center, which is also based in the San Francisco Bay Area, also creative youth development, also informed the case studies in this landscape paper. So we're going to see some slides that are scrolling that tell you a little bit more about the work that Youth Speaks does, our storytelling, our multiple disciplines that really center young people's narratives through writing, spoken word, theater, performance, and filmmaking. And really the goal of our work is to serve young people who experience the brunt of structural and systemic oppression, primarily young people of color in communities that have traditionally been silenced by underperforming schools, underinvested communities. And our work also deeply engaging with educators and our civic and business partners as we work together to change perceptions and narratives of our young people in our community. So a couple of reasons why I focus on this work. I think one of them is that I'm an alum of several youth development organizations from the 1990s in San Francisco. And I know personally that emerging leaders, of course, want to assert our own vision and style of leadership, and that this isn't new. But I think the opportunity right now in our social and cultural moment really gives us that opportunity to change how we do business in response to this. And so as we talk about this generation gap between the leaders that we need as we start to age out and burn out as administrative leaders in the nonprofit space, I really want to focus on how we're being responsive to this demand from this next generation of alumni who are really empowered and share a couple of characteristics that really inform the way that I'm trying to design our leadership model and structure to be more responsive. So many of the same challenges my generation faced around high housing costs, low wages, huge student loan debt, and the pressures of displacement and gentrification, we're still seeing those things, and we're seeing the same biases today because of, well, racism. They're socially conscious young people that are demanding that goods and services that they consume also be aligned with their values. And so they're pursuing really career pathways that align with that. And so that means that there is an opportunity in this social impact work that we're doing to really attract young people whose values align with the work that we're doing. But the way that we're set up doesn't always allow for arts organizations to match the administrative work with the practices as artists that young people want to continue. You know, how do you balance the administrative work and the hours and you're keeping up your arts practice? So finally, we talk about these top-down forms of leadership, and particularly in under-resourced nonprofits, because of the way we're designed, we're not really being super responsive when alumni finally transition into the workspace. So I know that there's a little bit of a gap between these safe spaces that we create for young people while they are participating in our programs and how we actually transition them into staff once they are hired on, and how we are set up internally to respond to really young people who are used to a very different model and approach. I think is really the question that we're trying to answer. And what we're really talking about is transforming the very foundation that created our entire industry. Because we know that nonprofit organizations were created using traditional business models, as was philanthropy, and those institutions are sometimes directly in tension with the values and the core mission of our work. So one recent example of how I know this to be true is right now Youth Speaks is an organization that is being led by women and people of color, serving primarily young people of color. And so I've wanted to come into the organization ensuring that we have the structure and the tools to develop this common approach to linking our values and working consistently with our equity and social justice mission. Yet I think that we lack the resources to establish the systems that folks need to actually build the supports as they move into leadership roles. So what I found at Youth Speaks is that as we transition from being a founder-led organization, many of the new leaders that emerged, the alumni leaders specifically that took on key leadership roles, this was the first time that they were doing the business of nonprofit administration, from managing and supervising people to creating and overseeing budgets to designing and implementing programs. And so I believe that we need to really develop robust systems that support training and development. And it is another program along a continuum of service as we're thinking about the life cycle of a young person's growth and development. And so this is, again, extending on the back end as we talk about career pathways and career development, which I know Shelby will be doing shortly. So a couple of examples of how we've really tried to transform our practices in-house is moving from this idea of being youth-centered and more into being youth-led and how we collaborate with institutions. So for example, we did this partnership with the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, featuring the work of pioneering social practice artist Suzanne Lacey and a retrospective of her late 90s project, We Are Here, which was a series of narratives that were collected from Oakland youth in the 90s as they shared their challenges with law enforcement, gentrification, and displacement, among other issues. And so one of our alumni who leads our marketing and communications work, Isa Nakazawa, really held the way that I want to describe it is she held this symbiotic peer-to-peer process where the poets worked with filmmakers that are also emerging, made up of 25-year-old filmmaker and photographer Colin Young of Manifest Creative and Olivia Avila, and 5 poets to create these digital narratives that didn't just include diverse voices, but were produced for and by the young people featured in the narratives. And so the way that the pilot was really held from this lens of an alum who really wanted to ensure that we weren't just centering diverse voices, but that we really were ensuring that there was a centering of how young people wanted their narratives to be presented, and the process behind that storytelling was a core feature of that. I'm going to take a quick pause just to do a time check. I want to make sure I have enough time for Shelby to present.
You're fine, Christy. You can, another 5 minutes is fine.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so I think that was just a really great way to think about how you can take something like a institutional partnership and turn it into an opportunity for the young leaders that are presenting their work to be in true partnership with not just being the content creators, but being fully in charge of how that content is presented in a public space and how they're engaged, and giving us insight into what that collaborative process can look like when you have the support that you need behind those young voices. That support was some of the most technical and practical pieces of actually setting up the exhibit to the approaches around producing those stories and how they'd be presented. One other example I want to share about different approaches to youth leadership and emerging leadership is around the Future Core Fellows program that I had the pleasure of being able to redesign at Youth Speaks. So originally this 2-year paid fellowship was designed to really develop this experience pipeline of emerging arts administrators and leaders, and focused around advancing equity, inclusion, and diversity in nonprofit arts education organizations. As we know, many of our organizations struggle in being able to include in their leadership members of the communities that we serve. And so this was something that was really important to us at Youth Speaks. And really taking a culturally relevant and competent lens and this framework to design a fellowship that would not just provide the hard skills for fellows to be able to lead in nonprofit administration, but also some soft skills and some of the cultural norms and expectations that you only learn when you're actually in the workplace. And so we redesigned the program to include training in those areas, and then finally really provide a supportive and nurturing mentorship opportunity by pairing the fellows with someone who is well-versed in creative youth development outcomes and in designing experiences that are very high touch and also can give these fellows really practical hands-on experience by leading projects in their placement organizations. We know it's important to compensate fellows as well. And so we made sure that we set entry-level salaries. These are full-time paid positions. They have health benefits. They have substantive work that they're going to do. And 10% of their time over the 2 years will be also leading a particular area of our annual Brave New Voices Festival, which is an international spoken word festival that Youth Speaks produces every year, which convenes about 50 different teams from across the nation and globally in a 4-day celebration of young people's voices and narratives. And so again, just really wanting to provide really high quality, very hands-on leadership experience with the support necessary to develop these emerging leader skills. So with those two examples, I'm hoping that this has inspired a lot of questions around how you might think about ways that you're already creating supportive systems, mechanisms, and resources for the emerging leaders in your organizations and those who want to take on more leadership roles, as well as an understanding that creating really intentional opportunities with lots of support also takes resources, and really investing the time and the money, quite frankly, to support these leaders. We can't just expect that our highly initiated young people who are amazing on the microphone will be ready to enter the workforce. And essentially, it is another part of our program that I think we can do better in terms of building up the continuum of learning and career growth for our emerging leaders. So I'm excited to also talk about some of the lessons that we've learned in this work at the end of this webinar. Really looking forward to your questions. And now I want to pass it along to Shelby of Artworks LA.
Thanks, Christy. So again, I'm Shelby Williams-Gonzalez from Artworks LA, based here in LA. And just to give you a little backstory on Artworks LA, we are in our 28th year as an organization, and we serve high school students in continuation high schools or those that are involved in the juvenile justice system. So the core of our programming is that we're an in-school program that serves, you can actually go to the next slide, over 1,000 students in 7 different school districts. And I just want to be clear, so we're in the schools during the school day, which I think is a really important part of building our multi-levels of programming to get our students involved and on the creative career pathway. So some of the CYD trends that Denise has laid out for us are very apparent in the work that we do in our teaching pedagogy and organizational culture. For example, and I will get to creative career pathways in a second, but the holistic approach to using arts as an engagement tool is really at the core of what we do. It's really about meeting our students where they are and building that relationship from there, which also then ties into the scaling by depth. And I think that Artworks LA has had the ability to stay around for so long, for lack of a better term, because we are committed to be partnering with our schools long term. So we have one school we've been in for 28 years. So it really becomes a continuation high school has this arts partner, but for a student who's there for high school, they just know that there's arts at their high school, right? And I think that's really important in it's a community of people that are supporting their education. And then also at the core of what we do is the collaboration, right? So Artworks LA, our program model is that we partner with museums and cultural institutions to create themes that then inspire our students to create work around those themes. And then present back at those institutions. So when students are then visiting those institutions, often for the first time, they're seeing their work is a reflection of a larger conversation that's happening in the museum. For example, last year we partnered with the USC School of Architecture, and we looked at creative ways to combat or to come up with solutions for our homelessness crisis here in Los Angeles. So our students, some of our students have experienced homelessness, but we want them to be on the end of how can we come up with some solutions. And we had some really great projects that came out of those conversations and those workshops. So that's just an example of what we do. So Artworks LA, in terms of the creative careers pathway, like I said, the 1,000 students that we're serving throughout the county in an academic year, all of those students have the opportunity to participate in additional programming, which we call advanced programs. And that's really where those students are coming to us or meeting us at other institutions, which is really nice to sort of break down. As many of you probably know, Los Angeles is sprawled out and it's not a public transit friendly. We're getting better, but we are behind. So we place internships, or excuse me, we place advanced programs, workshops, and residencies throughout the city for our students to access. So whether it's a music residency with the Young Producers Group, which is based right sort of downtown LA, or at Art Center in Pasadena, it's an opportunity for our students to see another part of the city and work with other Artworks LA students in these specific areas. Now, when we started this advanced programs in around roughly 2001, it really was an arts immersion program focus, right? It was about building the creative skills, and it has evolved into an internship model, as well as the next link in the creative careers pathway. So that's where we really find that it's important to go beyond just the skill building. Like what can our students do with those skills? So at the core of our mission is to get students to graduate from high school, right? But we can do more than that, because I think that's just the beginning of something. So in these advanced programs, it's an opportunity for our students to still focus on the creative skills making, but where can we put those skills into real action? How are they practical and useful for the next step? So we've actually come up with a paid internship program that we launched 3 years ago. And it was an opportunity to bring more students into our program, because we realized that to take extra time out of your life is a lot to ask. So if students applied and they showed some interest in our programs, we would do an honorarium or a stipend system, so that could help pay for transportation, sibling care, or child care. Right, so it was some incentive to get students involved. And we really noticed that that helped in keeping students for that year-long commitment into our program. That also gives us an opportunity to do a leadership class with our students to build resume writing skills and all the soft skills needed to then move into an internship outside of Artworks LA. So it's a step-by-step process, and I think we've really solidified our internal internship process. And now we have students who are doing paid internships through city programs such as the City of LA's Mayor's Evolve Entertainment Fund. So that's really looking at putting young people in paid internships over the summer and sometimes in the fall in the creative, specifically the film industry. So post-production houses, independent film festivals, and that kind of thing. We also then partner with the Big Soul Exchange, which is another city-run program to get our students into paid internships. And then I would also like to mention that we have our students then, once they are enrolled in college, they are able to access paid internships, and we can bring them back to our organization through things like the Getty Multicultural internship program, as well as the LA County Department of Culture and Arts and Culture, which used to be the LA County Arts, and some long title. So that's just some examples in terms of, so that's where I really wanted to start. I think lessons learned in all of this is that it's systems and step-by-step process, and Artworks LA is working to see how we can make this yeah, that's fine. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. How we can make this systematized, because we realize that at 28 years old, we're still very nimble, and we're able to get our students into these internship opportunities because we have personal relationships with, whether it's coming from our board, which is really supportive, or just who we know in our network. But how can we make that systemic so that we can get more students involved in this creative careers path? I'd also like to mention that in October of 2018, Artworks LA released a field scan specific to the LA County called Elevate, and you can actually see that paper and this website if you go to elevate.artworksla.org, or you just go on the Artworks LA page, you can see it, because the idea is that we want other people and other organizations to find partners to do this work, right? I think we're so good at working in silos and working to serve our students, but how can we serve the field as a whole? So that was the start of the Elevate, or that was the impetus for our Elevate site. And so I'll just leave that there, because I think, I would love to hear how we could help and make that grow.
Wonderful. Thank you all for such rich stories and examples, and you've given us a lot to think about. And I'm excited to kind of segue into our dialogue portion of today. Sabine, you can go right back to now the tiles so we can see each other a little closer. And hopefully you all can see us as well. There's a couple of questions coming in, so if you do have a question and you joined us late, you are muted still, but go ahead and type your question into the chat box, and we will get to as many of the questions as we can today. So one of the things that we discussed in preparing for this webinar and has come up throughout all of the stories is just how much work and intentionality it takes to really support young artists, both within programs and within organizations in their leadership. And then also as they're doing this work beyond the immediate program in their communities, that it just takes an enormous amount of support. And I guess maybe I'll start with you, Christy, if you could share a little. You mentioned that there is often a gap of between the experience that young people are having in CYD programs and then them segueing into leadership roles within an institution or beyond. And that more training is needed to really support them through that transition. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, and this is also a question for Shelby and Denise as well, but I'll start with you, Christy, about what kinds of supports you're seeing are needed and what kinds of training, both while they're in the program and then also, you know, Shelby, maybe to your point, as they might be going and working in partnership with others in the community.
Yes, excellent question. And I saw that Mika asked about that too. So I'll get at that question. Mika and I got a chance to work together at Destiny Art Center, and she's a deeply invested alum, has become the director of our youth performance company there, and is really invested and involved in evolving Destiny Art Center's approach and pedagogy. I think the needs that I've seen are really ranging from the practical, this is my first professional job, and I need hard skills and development and support to actually understand how to show up at the office, what the expectations are, and being really clear on what it means to do this work as a paid position. And that's really different from being a participant in the program. So there's that piece of it. But I also believe that alumni bring a really valuable perspective to the organization, and we have to make room for real-time feedback and evaluative practice. And then I've heard folks refer to this also as reflective practice, which is this idea that the feedback that you're hearing, not just from the young participants in the program, but now having alumni working within the structure of your organization who can actually tell you, you know, maybe in the design of this program, here's some things that you can do to be even more responsive and to better serve my peers. And I think that has to be part and parcel of how we structure the work. I think lastly, what I've also found is that nonprofit organizations who often have very little resources to support professional development within even existing staff are even more challenged when you have young people who really don't have a ton of working background or experience in things like fundraising, communications, marketing, and so they're really having to learn on the ground. And so what we've tried to do is, rather than send folks out to training or bringing experts in from the outside, we're tapping into the resources within the organization and creating opportunities for cross-departmental support and training, so that we are really using an intergenerational model and understanding that, yes, I've spent 15 years as an arts administrator, but I don't know everything there is to know about what it means to be a young person today, performing spoken word and being an artist in the community, while also engaging other young people who want to do more beyond the artistry. They actually want to apply their voices for change. They want to affect policy. How do we start linking those opportunities as well? And so I think that'll get to the partnerships as well. We're really looking into what organizations we can partner with that do organizing and civic engagement really well, rather than adding this on as a core part of the model. It's more around how do we partner with organizations that can then help advance that piece of the work and further support our alumni's engagement beyond being participants and beyond even being staff members of the organization. So that's my response to that.
Thanks, Christy. Shelby, I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit too, particularly the types of supports that you provide and feel your young artists need when they start working with some of your partners.
Sure. I think the biggest thing is that as the organization, we don't leave our students' sides. So when we do send them into these internships, they're, in addition to doing this work, they're still meeting with us literally on a weekly basis so that we can check in and see what they need. And so they have someone to, you know, whether it's, I think for anyone going into an office or into a job position, like to have someone that you can talk to, say like, I don't, you know, am I wearing the right outfit? Like, what do you do at lunch? Like very practical things down to, you know, can you guys help me with my Excel, you know, skills? So that is really important, that as an organization that's doing CYD work, we don't leave the students. It's not a handoff. We just become sort of the behind the curtain. I'd also like to point out that we think it's really important that Artworks LA, we want to prepare the employers that would be housing or holding our students. Sorry, that was a bad verb to use. To prepare employers for accepting our students. We've been doing professional developments within the teaching artist community. And in this last year, we've really spread that out to include partners that are doing the internships. So just recently, it was really nice to have some of our programming staff go and do a 2-day professional development for the USC School of Architecture that was going to be hosting a summer institute, and some of our students were going to be there. So it was an opportunity for their teaching artists to see how our teaching artists approach this work and just working with youth, and share those sort of best practices in really reminding folks that you have to know that everyone that coming into the door has a story, and you've got to be empathetic to that and meet students where they are, and then you can grow. And that does not mean that you're lowering your standards or that you have to modify things, but what can you do to really work with the people that are in the room? Those are the 2 points. And then actually Christy mentioned this when we were talking about, when we were preparing for this call. So I was wondering if we could go back to Christy, and if you could tell your example of when you had your students go to was it the opera, and just how you have to remind like that students, they can change the culture of the organization for good, right? But we have to let our the institutions remind them of that.
Yeah, one of the pedagogical principles that the founder was really proud of was bringing our young people into spaces where they traditionally were not either welcome or felt welcome. And so one example I've heard over and over again is what it meant to have 500 young people of color from all over the country at an opera house or at the Kennedy Center, and how the Kennedy Center staff were not necessarily accustomed to having that many teenagers who would break out in spontaneous ciphers in response to hip hop music, or scream loudly and stand up and clap for the poets who were on stage, because it's not necessarily something that we see at the Kennedy Center or at the Opera House. And so really wanting to prepare the partners and the spaces that we're going into about what our young people like to do to express their joy, and that's completely how we're encouraging young people to show up, and at the same time preparing young people to be in those spaces that they're not traditionally been in. And so things like, I'm trying to think of the specific example here, but I think you know what I'm talking about, where the ushers are like, shh, and we're just like, no, like show your love, just as a really simple, but I think telling example of the cultural frameworks and competencies that you need to always have top of mind as you're engaging different constituents and partners. So thank you for bringing that up, Shelby.
To piggyback on that, a question came in for you, Shelby, around, you had mentioned earlier your work specifically in schools, and I know a lot of CYD practice does happen out of school time because there is perhaps an opening to sort of really create the culture that you want to create, and maybe a little bit more freedom and agency to do that than often folks see in the school day. And so I'm curious, this question came in around actually how you really intentionally embed CYD practice and values while working within a school. And specifically how you work with schools to commit to this work so that it isn't just one program, but really influencing the culture of the school, and perhaps what you do when you're not as committed, what, you know, what that conversation looks like.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of working in the schools, I think it's really important that when we bring a school on board, that they know that this is a long-term commitment. And I like to approach it in two different ways. It's like, what do we want to accomplish? And yes, let's talk about funding also. But it's okay to separate those two, because the long-term goal is really what's at stake. And that change doesn't happen in 10 weeks for us. Even, you know, our program is 10 weeks, but you need to see it over at least the course of a year. So that's set out in the beginning, like principals, whoever's on faculty, they need to know that this is a long-term commitment, 1 year at the least, and knowing that we can make it work for 28 years. And it's really that's just the core of who we are. We have had some schools that it's really hard for them, because in Los Angeles, there are still some continuation high schools that have the model of catching students up on credits and then sending them back to comprehensive high schools. And those schools aren't necessarily ones that work for our model, because we want to see the students long-term in multiple workshops and then go on to our advanced programs. So schools commit by having that, you know, we write an MOU with our schools so they know that it's a year-long commitment. And it's been really nice in principal changes that there's always a conversation between the exiting principal and myself and the incoming principal that no, we're a program that wants to stay in that school, and we'll make it work. If we have to change schedules, so be it. But we're really there for the long term. Yeah, and then in terms of when schools are not committed, I mean, it doesn't happen often, but we have had to leave some of the schools just because it's not a cultural fit. We did, like I mentioned earlier, we had a school that was really on that model of sending the students back. So we weren't getting to know the students for more than like 5 or 6 weeks. And so it just, you know, and they had an art teacher on campus. So that just wasn't a place for us to be, you know, and then you go your separate ways. And Heather, I'm going to jump ahead because someone else asked about, do we only work with adjudicated youth or opportunity youth as well? And we do work with opportunity youth. So the way we, do you mind? Is that okay that I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead. I have one question for Denise when you're done.
Yeah, so the way that we work with the students is that we're going through the schools. So in our schools, students could have a myriad of coming from different places, you know, whether they're on probation or they've just opted into the alternative ed sort of framework. You know, we have both. So it's not that we're seeking out adjudicated youth or the opportunity youth, but that is typically the populations that we serve in the alternative ed system. That's all.
Thank you very much.
If you have another question, Armando, I'll answer.
Thanks so much, Shelby. Denise, this is a question for you, and then really I'm curious to hear from Shelby and Christy as well in terms of what this might look like within your own institutions and practice. But earlier, Denise, you noted how important it is in the delivery of programs and the programs themselves to really be paying attention to self-care, that so much of this work, both the work itself and supporting young artists on the front lines, it's important to also think about how we're supporting teaching artists, how we're supporting administrative staff and each other. And I wonder if you might speak a little bit more to that point and any examples or strategies or models you've seen in your research of how organizations are approaching that.
I would love to hear from anyone who wants to share in the chat box too, because, and Mika did, and I think framed it well, because I think, we're at a point of change. And at the same time, I do think that many organizations, in spite of very good intentions and awareness, are in, perhaps more of a reactive mode to when someone is exhibiting signs of stress, or saying like, hey, I just need, I need some time, or, so, but I know that organizations are, for example, Transcendence in San Diego is a dance organization that I know in preparation for their upcoming strategic planning and I think board retreat, they have on the agenda to discuss as part of their strategic planning process, I think more formally and proactively planning for and embedding self-care for teaching artists in in their program models. And so to plan in advance and make sure that it happens. And I also, there's some conversations that are happening. There's a woman who's a teaching artist and leader in the CYD community in San Diego, Shayla James, and she has initiated a number of more intimate conversations, small scale teaching artists only conversations that I believe and have heard have been a wonderful forum for teaching artists to share their experiences and to support one another, and to really have the focus of the conversation be about what they're experiencing in their work. And that community and time together, I think, has been very nurturing. So those are just two examples, and would love to hear from Shelby and Christy, and also anyone else who's part of the webinar.
I'll say at Youth Speaks, we've taken on a very intentional programming model, given that the work that we do elicits, excuse me, so much trauma, and young people really sharing stories that can be traumatic in their content, but are really meant to give voice to it and to move through it when we talk about resilience and coming from a place that's trauma informed, but then moves towards resilience and becoming from a place of strength. So we've actually partnered with Kaiser very deeply the past several years to provide mental health support stations at all of our youth events, from our slam poetry competitions to our Brave New Voices Festival. We partnered with mental health providers, volunteers, and have resources from counselors on site to what we call decompression zones, where we have space for a young person to talk to someone, or to draw or write, or have different tools at their disposal to be able to respond to what's happening, both physically or emotionally, as they are potentially triggered by the content. But we haven't translated that internally. And so I think, again, that kind of goes to show this focus on youth services, youth service delivery, and a high quality program, but we're not doing the same that care for the folks who are actually delivering the work. I think there's a huge opportunity there. And I'd love to figure out who is actually addressing the work from that point of view, as to me, then that would be completely aligned around our mission and ensuring that we are in a healthy place as we're doing this really challenging work. As we know, burnout is a high need area to address in the sector too. And I think that these things are related in terms of like self-care, and in particular in mental health. I want to leave room for Shelby to answer. I know it's 11 o'clock, I'm sorry.
I would like to mention that I see what you're saying is also, it's a great modeling for the young leaders that you're bringing up within your institution, to see them, to see the adults in their lives and within the institution taking that time to support each other and themselves. So it's sort of tying it back to your earlier statement of really modeling at the institutional level what's happening at the programs and program level too. We are at time, but Shelby, I want to give you one final thought moment here to just respond briefly before we say goodbye today.
Sure. So I would just say, I guess my final thought is that I know that everyone out there is doing amazing work, and it's hard work. So one, make space for you to celebrate at least every day what you do. I want to thank you all for the work that you do. That seriously, like in terms of self-care, like you should wake up every day and high five yourself, power pose, whatever you need. I mean, I know that's a Band-Aid, but celebrate what you're doing. And also that this is not work that we need to do alone. That's really what I'm learning as I move into this executive director role, is that I have so many pieces of the puzzle, and it's really about like pulling those pieces closer and closer together. And it takes a long time, and it takes doing and redoing, but I think that helps us head in a direction of actual making systemic change.
Word.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for everyone who spent an hour with us today to learn, to listen, to share your thoughts on the chat. If we did not get to your question, I promise that I will share this transcript with our speakers so that we can get back to everybody. A recording of today's session will be shared with all of you, along with another copy of Denise's paper. So if you haven't had an opportunity to read the paper, I really encourage you to do it. It's wonderful. And I also encourage you to join us for the rest of this series. This is the second webinar in a 7-part series, which will feature all of the landscape papers that are part of the forthcoming CYD Toolkit, and each will be followed up with an opportunity for dialogue like this one with young people, with practitioners of the work, and other thought leaders. So join us along the way, stay in touch, and just another shout out to Denise, Shelby, and Christy for all your insights and great conversation today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to staying in touch with everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye.